Welcome to the Huggadrum podcast, a life with drums and drumming. I am your host, Angus McCurrach, and you're very welcome. And now, let the drumming begin. Yes, it's the Huggadrum podcast, your rhythmic respite from reality. Fun with drums, including
Drumming joke of the week.
The anagram Drumagram.
and drums for life, well-being and drumming.
And now, here is your host from the Shedio. It's himself.
Yes, it's myself, and welcome to episode 2 of the HuggCast. You're so very welcome, and if this is the first time you've listened to this will be an experience you'll never forget. I've forgotten what I was going to say next. Anyway, so it's been a really interesting week. One of the highlights of my week was purchasing a new rubbish bin for the kitchen. But this is no ordinary rubbish bin. This is one of the elite. This rubbish bin has reached the apex of binness. This rubbish bin is a full 50 litres in volume, so it can contain all my recycling. I don't know about you guys, but what I found over the years is that the amount of recyclable material is beginning to far outweigh the other rubbish that needs to go to landfill or wherever it goes. So I was finding that the bin that I had for my recycling was just not big enough. So I decided to get myself a larger recycling bin. But here is the exciting thing. This is so exciting. And if you are standing at the moment or driving, I suggest you sit down and pull over. The exciting thing about this drum, the exciting thing about this rubbish bin is that it has an automatic opening lid. So as you approach the bin with your empty tin can or your piece of crumpled up paper, the lid automatically opens and you just drop the piece of recyclable rubbish in to the bin. It is amazing, and I do not know how I have survived all my years without an automatic lid on my bin. However, I've started talking to the bin because sometimes as you move towards it, the lid opens when you didn't really want the lid to open. And it's like being attacked unawares by some saber-toothed rubbish bin. Suddenly its mouth opens and you go, ah! And then you remember it's an inanimate rubbish bin. Well, inanimate, apart from the moving lid, of course. And I have had a few starts. I have been briefly scared, and that jolt of adrenaline that suddenly comes when something you don't expect comes flying round the corner, or a loud noise, or just something that makes you, very quickly have a sharp intake of breath. And so I've started to fight back. I've started telling the bin that it needs to understand what its place is in the universe, that it's there to serve. It is not entitled to move and talk or whatever it wants to do without fulfilling its purpose of opening its lid and closing it again. And I feel a bit guilty about it. I'm feel I'm having an emotional attachment to this rubbish bin. I think I'll overcome. But in this episode 2, we are going to be looking at what's called the stress response. We're going to be looking at a short film which illustrates how stress impacts on us using the world famous stress drum with its little drumsticks sticking out the side. I bet you can't wait. And it's about demonstrating how stress tends to build up in us, but also how we can find ways of reducing that stress. So, using my newly purchased automatic rubbish bin as an example, I have been getting the old jolt of adrenaline because this thing suddenly comes to life when I'm not expecting it. And that can be explained by the stress response. So I haven't run away from the bin yet. So far that's a tactic I've not had to employ. Anyway, you're very welcome to this second episode, and we're going to crack on firstly with some interesting insights into the life of a gigging drummer. I used to play in a fine blues band called the Blue Hyenas. The Blue Hyenas were fantastic. There was 3 of us. Well, actually 4 at one point. It mainly was 3 latterly. So there was myself on drums, a fantastic bass player called Gareth Jones, and an amazing guitarist, Sandy Tweedill. And we were a fantastic blues trio. Used to travel around, gigging here, there and everywhere. And prior to that, there was also a keyboard player, Brian Walker, and probably more of Brian than other podcasts, because I played in bands with him before that too. Anyway, so the Blue Hyenas, we are touring around, and one sunny day, I think it may have been in June, we are playing at a music festival, and we are in a marquee, a big, huge, white marquee tent, and it's pitched on grass, so there's that smell of newly cut grass, the sun's shining, and it's an amazing summer's day. And in the marquee, there is a band stand, or stage, I should say, at the back of the tent, which is where the band and all the music PA equipment is set up. Now, this stage must have been 3 feet off the ground, and as usual, the drum kit is set up at the back of the stage. So the back of the stage, as you might expect, backs onto the rear of the marquee tent. So basically there's nothing stopping the poor drummer who's sitting at the back of the stage from falling over through the back of the marquee tent and onto the ground. If you can imagine, my drum stool was a couple of inches away from the edge, so I was conscious, very conscious all the time of not leaning backwards, as one might do occasionally if you think there's a wall behind you. So I was very conscious of that. And so we're playing a gig, and I'm playing away on the drums, kind of conscious that there's this 3-foot drop behind me, and the chaos that would ensue if I happened to fall backwards. Anyway, everything's under control. That's alright. I'm able to keep drumming and be conscious of not breaking my back at the same time by falling over. And then the wasps start to arrive. Now, I don't mind wasps. There was a time when I hated wasps. I would react very... I would run away, basically. And then that all changed because one afternoon I was cooking some food in the house and on a gas hob, and a wasp came in through one of the kitchen windows and flew straight at me, and in order to avoid the wasp I ducked very quickly, and the wasp flew on about its business. Meanwhile, I had smashed my forehead on a hot, burning gas hob. And at that very point, I think before I'd even learned what risk analysis was, and risk assessment was, in my head I very quickly did that calculation. Wasp can sting, sting can be painful, pain goes away. Versus battered head on gas hob, could have set fire to hair, could have smashed head open, could have knocked himself out. In other words, a wasp sting versus what potentially could be a very nasty accident made me realise that I needed to put things in a bit more perspective. So from then on, I was able to live with wasps. Another of my little tangents there about wasps, but taking you back to the marquee. This marquee is full of people. Blue hyenas were quite popular, and we drew a crowd. So this particular sunny June afternoon, it's warm in the tent, everybody's drinking beer, having fun. This of course is before COVID, when, obviously we can't do these things at the moment, but this is a few years ago. I'm playing away, conscious that there's a 3-foot drop behind me, and not wanting to fall over, and then a family of wasps. I can only presume that Mr. and Mrs. Wasp had decided to take the kids on a day out to the blues festival. Anyway, the entire family are buzzing around me, and what I am then having to do, because the show must go on, I'm, playing the drums, hi-hat, tom-tom, cymbals, and then wasps start to arrive. So in between beats, I'm trying to get the wasps out of the way. In between hitting a cymbal, I'm trying to get another wasp out of the way. And so my arms, between playing the drums in the appropriate places, are going everywhere. I survived. I didn't fall over. I didn't miss a beat. And I didn't get stung. And afterwards, came down off the stage, and, some very friendly Blue Hyenas fans came over to show their appreciation. They really enjoyed that. And one guy says to me, I really loved your drumming. I thought that was amazing. And I couldn't believe what you were doing with your sticks during that last song. It was incredible. Your hands were everywhere. And it suddenly made me realise this guy thought I was doing this as part of the show. He had no appreciation that this had been me versus a Mr. and Mrs. Wasp and family. And it must have looked spectacular, but all I was doing was trying to keep myself from being stung. But it brings me to the point of this story, and it's something that I learnt years ago, that if an audience doesn't realise what's coming up next, you can get away with all sorts of things. You can make the odd mistake. You can go off script. A song can change suddenly because someone's forgotten what was happening next. But if the audience doesn't know, they won't realise. And I think that's one of the truisms of show business, that if you just keep going on, you can get away with anything. And I always used to say to Gareth, who was the bass player in the Blue Hyenas, if I ever make a mistake on the drums, I repeat it in the next verse, because then people think it was deliberate. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. And now it's time for the Drumagram. So, before we go into this week's Drumagram, let's just tell you the answer to last week's one. So the answer was drum pedal. Drum pedal. So for those of you that are used to playing drum kits, you will know what the drum pedal is. It hits the bass drum. So that was it, drum pedal. And now it's time for this week's Drumagram. And again, send your answers to HuggCast@huggadrum.com and you could win a prize. Now, I know you're all incredibly excited about this next item. This is the world famous stress drum. So what's this all about then? Well, stress is something that we all have to have. It's necessary. Stress is something that gets us up in the morning. Stress is that reaction that stops us from crossing a road when a car suddenly comes rushing round the corner. It supports us. It defends us. It's a mechanism that allows us to survive. So it's necessary. But in this world that we live in, there are all sorts of sources of stress that build up and build up and build up. And it gets to the point where some might describe it as distress. So it stops us from functioning in the way that we want to. So this little model using the stress drum kind of demonstrates how that all works, and how, for example, you get that straw breaking the camel's back phenomena, where it seems to be just one tiny thing that suddenly kicks you off and you become anxious or angry or frightened or scared. And what this hopes to demonstrate is how there are ways of coping with your stress in a healthy way. Before we have a look at the stress drum, I just wanted to talk about something that you've probably heard about before. It's the fight or flight mechanism. So, if you can imagine that you're in the jungle with my favourite legendary beast, the saber-toothed dinosaur, and you're wandering through the jungle, maybe looking for berries and nuts to eat, and all of a sudden, from round a big boulder, a big jaggedy rock, comes this jagged toothed, saber-toothed dinosaur. I think we'll call him George, it just makes it easier. Anyway, George comes round the corner. He's actually looking for his breakfast. He sees you and he thinks, quite fancy a bit of human. And what your brain and your body do instantly is react using the fight or flight mechanism. If you can imagine, there's possibly 2, sometimes 3 ways of surviving a situation where George suddenly appears. One is to run like hell, run away and get away from the saber-toothed George, possibly by climbing a tree or just running fast enough so that he can't keep up. The second one is to actually stand and fight. So you might have a big wooden club or something, or even just your bare hands, and depending on the size of George. I mean, describing George as a saber-toothed dinosaur, he could be 2 inches tall. On the other hand, he could be 10 foot tall. So it is possible that you would be able to defend yourself and survive by fighting. And the third way, which is often forgotten about, is fright. You just freeze. You freeze there. A bit like the rabbits in the headlight of a car. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes that's a good strategy as well, just to keep still. It's not going to work with George, though, because he can smell you. He can already taste what your flesh would taste like. And he likes fleshlings for dinner. So, let's just go back to these other 2 options. You either run like hell, or you stand and fight. Now, it doesn't matter which one of those you choose to do. What you will need in both of these scenarios is power to your muscles. You need energy to go to your muscles. That involves oxygen, it involves sugars in the blood, it involves shutting down anything that's not necessary in order for you to run or fight. So what happens is your blood flow gets suddenly diverted to your muscles to give them the strength and the power that they need. And that means that blood travels away, for example, from your digestive system, so your stomach. Ever had butterflies in your tummy when you were nervous? That's what's happening. And the other thing that happens, and there's not really a polite way of saying this, I shall say it politely, you evacuate your bowels. You shit yourself. So, if you've ever been in a situation where you've been so frightened that you have evacuated your bowels, that again is part of this fight or flight response. Getting rid of the stuff that you don't need in order to survive. So the blood gets diverted to your muscles. One of the things that happens in order for that to happen quickly is your blood pressure increases. Okay, so your blood pressure increases, your heart rate increases to pump more and more blood around your body. And because you need that vital oxygen to supply energy to the muscles, your breathing rate increases. I don't know if any of this is sounding familiar. Your breathing increases. You can feel your chest thumping. Okay, you've got butterflies in the stomach. You're rapidly breathing, and your blood pressure is increasing. That is the fight or flight response. That is the stress response. So, I'm sure we've all experienced some, if not all, of these symptoms of fight or flight. In the modern world, there's not very many saber-toothed Georges around. But what there is are millions of sources of stress. All sorts of things can trigger the fight or flight response. It could be your boss at work. It could be you've been asked to do far too much in too little time. Maybe you've had an argument with your partner. Maybe you're going through some kind of difficult life situation, a bereavement, maybe someone in the family has died. Possibly you're moving house. There is a top 10 list of the biggest causes of stress and anxiety, and moving house is right up there. along with getting married, and all of these things that we come into in daily life. Your car breaks down, you're late for an appointment. These can all cause you to have that fight or flight response, the stress reaction. In today's world, it would be inadvisable in many of these situations, certainly to fight. I know it might be tempting sometimes to fight your boss, but normally, for the great majority of us, we just have to kind of soak it up. Likewise for a lot of these other situations. Tempting as it may be to run away from your broken down car in the middle of the motorway, we have to stick around and see it through. But all of these chemicals, these stress-related chemicals, these hormones, things like adrenaline, noradrenaline, that go hurtling through your body to promote this stress response, they're still sloshing around. Okay? So you need to find ways of getting rid of all that stressiness without running away or fighting. And there are ways of doing that. So what the stress drum does is kind of illustrates how we build up our stress, but also how we can deal with it. So this next segment is partly sponsored by Buchan Counselling from Peterhead in Aberdeenshire. And if you have any questions related to anxiety, stress, or any other mental health issues, send them an email. You can get in touch with them at info@buchancounselling.com. That's info@buchancounselling.com. But now, let's have a look at the world-famous stress drum. Here is the famous stress drum. Inside, this drum contains your stress, and you can see it's near the top. And round the sides of the drum, little drumsticks are sticking out, and we'll come to those later. As daily life carries on, all sorts of things cause stress. Maybe you set your alarm for the wrong time, endure a trip of stress, an argument with your partner or family member. More stress drips into your bucket. Just the little things in life cause little drips and drips of stress. And then sometimes stressful things happen in a gushing way. The car breaks down, and then something else comes along. You've run out of money at the end of the month. Oh, and somebody's coming to visit, and that's stressful. You've got to tidy the house. Another argument over breakfast. And then maybe another big thing comes along. Oh, I think this could be the broken down washing machine. Just look at all that stress going into your stress drum. And it's getting closer and closer to the top of the drum. But sometimes there's the straw that breaks the camel's back. And this could be one trip, or it could be a huge stressful event. Something big that's happened in life. Watch what happens to your stress. It starts to overflow. Your stress drum is no longer big enough to hold all your stress. So what do we do about that? Well, that's where the drumsticks come in. Because each of these drumsticks represents something that relieves stress. This one could be exercise. What happens when we take this one out? Well, do regular exercise, and that will help to relieve some of the stress. Another drumstick could be going for a walk, reading a book, listening or playing music. And again, more of your stress is relieved. leaving more room in your bucket to deal with everyday things in life. And there's more coming out. Each of these drumsticks represents something that you can do, like yoga or relaxation exercises to reduce your stress. And that is the stress drum.
Drumming joke of the week.
This week's joke takes us to a beautiful volcanic island called La Gomera. It's one of the Canary Islands, so it's just off the coast of North Africa. And while I'm talking to you now from the northeast of Scotland, it's snowing and it's cold. So this joke takes you to sunnier and warmer climes. So I'm on an airplane flying in to the Canary Islands. It's beautiful, warm and sunny, and the sea is just kissing the beach, and the water is blue, and it's just amazing. And I need to get to the island of La Gomera, which means I have to take a ferry. So I go to the ferry, and it's a short journey, maybe an hour or so, across the sea to the volcanic island of La Gomera. And as you begin to approach La Gomera, you can see why it's volcanic. It's got that typical funnel, upside down funnel look about it. And as we get closer to La Gomera, we start to hear something. Just very quietly at first. It's the sound of drums. And as we slowly manoeuvre in to the ferry terminal, the drums get louder and louder. I was very curious. As you know, I quite like drums, but it was like the drums were being played all over the island. So I got off the ferry and I had to go and pick up my rental car. So I went to the rental car office and did all the usual paperwork. Do you want to be insured just in case your leg falls off, or in case your hair falls out, or if you have a crash with another car, we can insure you so that you not only don't have to pay anything, but you'll receive $10 million as a reward. Anyway, you know the usual thing about insurance, trying to persuade you to part with your money. Anyway, so I'm going off on a tangent again. Not like me, I know. Anyway, we're on La Gomera and I'm at the car rental office. And just before I take the keys and head off, I just happened to say to the gentleman, "What's the story with the drums?" And he looked very nervous. This very confident, very bubbly, effervescent, charming gentleman had suddenly become nervous. It was as if I had discovered some vital clue about his person, about some incredibly murky, dark crime that he'd been involved in. Actually, all I had done was asked, why can I hear drumming everywhere I go? So this nervous man looked at me and he said, "Ah, don't worry about the drumming. Just you'll get used to it. It's fine. It's part of our culture." And I said, "But I'm not worried. I enjoy drumming. That's something that I do. I just wondered if it was part of a festival. Is it some significant day? Why is there so much drumming?" "Oh, don't worry about it. Just enjoy your trip, and just try to forget about the drums." So off I went, and I found my little car, and I started to drive. Now I'd been to La Gomera before, so I knew my way around, and I knew that being a volcanic island, there was never any suitable ground on the landscape round about the perimeter of the island, which is more or less a circle. Not enough landscape for them to build roads, so you can't really drive around La Gomera. If you want to get from one side of the perimeter to the next, you really have to drive up into the mountains, over the top, and down the other side. So there's a number of roads that crisscross over the centre of the island. And it's a magnificent trip. You drive up from the hot, balmy, African Ocean into the green, lush, almost rainforest type environment, and it gets colder as you go up, as you would imagine. And every time I opened the window, I could hear the drums. The drums were always there, and when I looked out, it was as if the birds were beating their wings in time to the drums. But the drums never stopped. So I drove eventually to the other side of the island, and I found my apartment that I'd rented for a week. Now, La Gomera is, as you can imagine, uphill or downhill. There's not very many flat bits apart from on the coast, so I had to walk about 4 minutes worth up steps and up more steps and up steps and up steps and up steps until I got to my apartment. And all the time I could hear the drums. The drums never stopped. The drums never stopped. Halfway up the steps on the way to my apartment was a little shop which sold the basic things: rice, water, tea, coffee, ice cream, which was I was very grateful for the ice cream. And I asked the old woman who was in the shop, "What's the story about the drums?" And she nearly dropped the tray of baklava that she was holding. "Don't worry about the drums," she said. "The drums, we need the drums. We don't want the drums to ever stop. The drums must keep going. We want the drums to keep going." And again, I was conscious of almost saying something offensive. I was merely inquiring about the nature of these drums. But I hadn't caused offence. I think this old woman, showed a genuine level of fear almost about not wanting the drums to stop. So anyway, I thanked her very much and took my freshly baked bread and some milk, tea and coffee and my ice cream, and I went to my apartment. And it was beautiful. It had a little balcony, and when I sat out on the balcony, I was almost surrounded by olive trees, and I could see bananas in the background. There was a banana tree behind me. It was spectacular, a fantastic view out over the beach. And I could hear the drums. The drums were wafting through the air, permeating the whole atmosphere of La Gomera. Drums, drums, and drums. Now, I have to confess, it was getting to the point where I was getting quite irritated. Not so much about the drumming, but about the lack of explanation. You know, I'd tried a couple of times to try and find out what it was all about, and I was still bemused. I was bemused. I was confused. I was on the verge of being distraught for lack of explanation, for lack of a possible answer to my question. What is going on with the drumming? Everywhere I went, drumming, drumming, drumming. So, that night, I decided to go down to this fantastic little taverna on the edge of the sea. Maybe have some tapas or some of the other fantastic local olives. I had a glass of red wine, and I waited along with lots of other people for the sunset. Spectacular sunsets on La Gomera. Beautiful, almost blood red, orange colours just cascading and bouncing off the ocean as the sea begins to lap over the sun as it goes down. Absolutely beautiful. And all the time, I could hear the drums. Drum, drum, drums. And I turned to a fellow traveller and said, "You noticed the drums?" "Noticed the drums," he said. "I've been asking all day what these are about and getting some very strange reactions." "Well," I said, "funny you should say that. I've been exactly the same. I mean, they're beginning to be quite annoying now, I must admit. I mean, I don't mind drums, in fact, something that I'm very much involved with. But it's constant. It's beginning to be like a drip, drip, drip from a tap." So we both agreed we were going to find out what was going on about these drums. And we happened to notice there was actually a policeman nearby. So we both went up to him and said, "Excuse me, officer, do you mind if we ask you a question?" And he said, "No, of course not. We always welcome inquiries from people that visit us. How can we help?" I said, "We're just wondering about these drums." Oh, don't worry about the drums. Just forget about the drums. Okay, you'll begin to get used to the drums. It's part of our culture. Just please don't. We never want the drums to stop. We never ever want the drums to stop. The drums can't stop. And I thought, this is very peculiar. This is an officer of the law who is almost as petrified of the stopping of these drums as he would be if he'd come across some, I don't know, prehistoric creature crawling through the undergrowth of La Gomera. A saber-toothed tiger pouncing at him from behind a rock. Or some kind of giant La Gomeran hornet buzzing around his head would have caused as much terror as the thought of the drums stopping. So I said to him, "What happens when the drums stop?" And he said, "Well, that is why this is so frightening." when the drums stop, the bass player starts his solo.
Drumming joke of the week.
Well, I hope you've enjoyed this week's podcast, and there will be another one coming out next week. So, thank you so much again for watching or listening to the HuggCast. And again, just to remind you that we are sponsored by buckandcounselling.com and Huggadrum.com, and that you can buy drums or kits to build drums from hand-picked drums, and you can get details from the Huggadrumshop.com. That's the Huggadrumshop.com if you want to find out more about that. But again, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next week. Bye.